trying to have a little bit of a conversation in a remote session, even though I'm not seeing you guys and I'm not sharing my video right now because I live in the country. I live outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and I have the worst internet in the world, I believe. Not in the world, but this is actually a first world problem. But I have horrible internet, so I usually don't share video just because I don't want to have that lag and that disjointedness in my session. But I do heavily rely on the chat because I want to hear your questions and what you have going on. So let me make sure that I can get that up on my screen. And so pop into the chat if you can, and let me confirm that you can see my screen and everything, and that you can hear me okay. That would be great. Just anybody. Yep. Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Thank you for making time today. I know a few of you in the chat, so hello. I appreciate you finding time in your day. I know there's a lot going on, but I think that sometimes it's really good to step away from what else is going on and think about, the technical things and the things that really interest us. So hopefully you all have an interest in extended events. So this is another opportunity to use this chat while I continue to do my introduction. And what I want to know is if you have used extended events, yes or no? And if you have, what's gone well and what hasn't gone well? And then if you haven't used extended events, is there any particular reason why? So if you can throw some of those things into the chat right now as I'm talking, that would be awesome. That helps me understand kind of where you're coming from and then frame some of my slides and demos appropriately. So a little bit about me. My name is Erin Stellato. I work for SQL Skills. And a little bit about me. I've been at SQL Skills for almost 8 years at this point. This is all the yay me stuff. Most important thing on here is my email address. I definitely encourage you to ask questions today. If you have any, please put them in the chat. But if you don't get anything answered today or you think of something later on, please send me an email, Erin@SQLskills.com. Or if you're on Twitter, give me a shout out there as well. I'd love to hear from you. Again, I work for SQL Skills. The owners are Paul, Randall, and Kimberly Tripp. The remaining team, myself, Jonathan Cahias, and Tim Radney. Kimberly and Paul, some people know that they're married to each other. The rest of us, we are not married to each other. We have our own separate marriages, relationships that we deal with. But we provide training, not just through remote user groups and conferences, but also our own immersion events. So we were supposed to have training in the end of April, beginning of May. We've moved that to the fall. We also have training through Pluralsight, and we also offer consulting. So if you ever need help with anything, we're there. Just hit our website, SQLskills.com. And if you want to hear from us on a regular basis, we have our insider newsletter. Again, information about our classes, and I'll just direct you to the site. I don't want to take up too much time with that, but training tells you what our schedule looks like, and then our services page tells you about consulting. And if you've never tried Pluralsight, and I always feel like everybody has, but I know that I'm wrong. But if you've never tried Pluralsight, you can email Paul. I love giving out his email address, paul@SQLskills.com. You can email him, ask for a code for 30 days free of Pluralsight. You don't have to enter any credit card or anything like that. And we have several classes. So I've got classes related to Query Store, classes related to extended events. Actually, John's got a couple classes out there as well. We've got over 50 at this point if you're interested in additional learning from our team. The scripts for this session, along with the slides, can be obtained from our website. So on the SQL Skills site, there's a resources page, and then there's a user group page, and everything is available there. And this is the abstract, which I'm not going to read aloud to you because I'm thinking you've already read it and you have some interest in extended events or how to go from what you know in Profiler to extended events. And our plan today is to talk about how we do that. So I will tell you that when I like to say grew up with SQL Server, when I started with SQL Server back in SQL Server 2000, Profiler was the tool to see what was going on. So Profiler and Perfmon, those are the tools that I grew up with. And when Extended Events was released with SQL Server 2008, I remember seeing Jonathan present on it. And I was like, I do not understand what that man is talking about at all. And he did some really cool demos and tracked down some really interesting problems. And I was like, that's great, but this makes no sense to me. Well, then I start working with Jonathan and I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to figure this out at some point. And so I teach this class or this session from the perspective of how it makes sense to me. So let me look at my comments here. So profiler only. Okay, I get you. I was there once too. Microseconds, I'll mention that. Extended properties, not events. Okay. Finding the right events. I can help you with that. It's so easy to open Profiler, have my template, and filter things out. Okay, Dan, I'm going to show you how I think it's just as simple, if not even simpler, in extended events. Deadlocks. Interesting. We might have to dig into that easier, a little bit in more detail. So errors that could be indicative of injection attempts. Ooh, that's creative. I love extended events, but X query can be a bit to wrestle with. Oh, I hear you. I hear you, and I'll talk about how I manage that as well. So these are some great things. Now I want to just set the stage in terms of what extended events. In the documentation, it says general event handling system for server systems, which, okay, we've got system in there twice, which doesn't help me. And it doesn't really define event. And if you look further, there's extended events infrastructure supports the correlation of data from SQL Server. So there's a couple important things here, the infrastructure. So extended events is part of the SQL Server engine. It's actually within SQL OS. And this extended events infrastructure is created to help us get information from SQL Server and correlate it to things of interest that happen. So I tried to kind of put it in my own words, right? An infrastructure which gives us the ability to create complex sessions to collect event information. And when we talk about profiler, we tend to say, I'm going to start a profiler session, or I'm going to run profiler, or I'm going to run a trace. When we talk about extended events, we say we're going to start an event session. So these sessions are way more interesting and way more powerful than what we could do with trace. And again, when we talk about an event, this to me was a fundamental aha thing. An event is something of interest inside SQL Server. So think of the default trace and the things that are in the default trace, like a data file auto grow, or what else is in there? Object created, log file grow. There's a memory changes in there. There's a hash spill, right? All of those things are events, something of interest within SQL Server. So again, extended events came out in SQL Server 2008. So it's 12 years old at this point. It's almost a teenager, and it's part of SQL OS. So if you think of this pictorially, right, we have our engine and the OS, and then the extended events engine inside of that. And this engine, this infrastructure, is services and objects that it manages and that it interacts with other points in SQL Server. So when I say services and objects, I mean like SQL OS, the DLL, and there's Hackathon DLL, and those DLLs and those EXEs, the SQL Server EXE, those are the different services and objects that the extended events engine interacts with. Now the objects, because this is a term that you sometimes hear when people talk about extended events, are these events, which I've mentioned, and our targets. A target is where do I want the data to go? Our predicates, predicate is a where clause, it's a filter. We know what those are. Our actions, this is something additional that I want to collect. And our types and our maps, which are related to kind of some internals for extended events. And all of these different things are part of different packages in extended events. So this is just kind of a logical grouping within extended events. Hang on. Couldn't mute fast enough. Sorry, apologize for that sneeze there. So we have our package, and we have our events, our predicates, our actions, our targets, our types, and our maps. And we have multiple packages within extended events. And again, this is just a logical way that things are grouped. We can have an event session which pulls different events and targets and actions from different packages. So there's more than one package, and then we've got all our different events, etc. So I'm going to hop right into a demo because I'm a very visual learner. And if you're not a visual learner, hopefully as I'm talking through this, this is still going to make sense to you. So we're actually going to start in what we know and love, which is Profiler. And we're going to go ahead and say new trace, and we'll connect to our instance. I am running 2017 here, but everything that I'm doing is applicable in 2019, meaning that Profiler is still there in 2019. And I know that you probably all know that it was deprecated as of SQL Server 2008, but it just keeps showing up. And I mentioned that Extended Events is almost a teenager. Do you know how old Profiler is? It was released with SQL Server 7.0, which was released in, does anybody know the year without Googling it? I want to wait and see if anybody knows the year. Bueller. Nobody's brave to guess. Oh, 98. Nice, Bill. Yes, 1998. Good. So it is a legal adult at this point, right? It can go drink. So it's an old utility. It's been around for a long time, and it's not something that's being improved at all at this point. But what's easy, right? What someone mentioned already is that, Dan, right? It's easy to open Profiler, have my template, filter things out. And guess what? That's exactly what we're going to do. So we've opened Profiler. We're coming to our filter, or excuse me, our template that I've already set up called High Reads. And before I forget, I did not do this earlier. Let me open up Zoom it just so that I have it available. Grace me a second here, friends. Brilliant. Okay, so we have our High Reads filter, and if we go to our events, you'll see that we've got 2 events selected here, just RPC completed and SQL statement completed. And I've got smattering of columns selected here that I want to capture. And if we check out our column filters, you'll notice here that for reads, I have reads greater than or equal to 10,000. So I always want to put a filter on my trace. That's going to be true for extended events. And we're just saying for both of these events, we want reads greater than or equal to 10,000. So I say, okay, and I say run. And this right here is heavy. So I stop this because running the UI here adds overhead to my system. I do not want to do that. So hopefully most of you are stopping this, exporting this out to a trace definition, which will put this out in my temp folder, save that, come into Management Studio, and grab it. So this is the definition for a trace. And I have a copy of this that I want to open that I've actually commented. And it looks just like the one we had, but I've added a few things. But I would be willing to bet a good bar of chocolate that no one has come in here and created one of these manually because it is not intuitive. And there's a couple things that are just not easy to remember. We start by creating a queue. We have the declaration of a few variables, a trace ID, a max file size. And then we have SP trace create with that trace ID. And we have a location to which we want our file to be written, right? When we use Profiler, sometimes we just look at it in the UI. Again, that's not optimal. Or we have it write out to a file, still not optimal. Here, we always are going to write it out to a file. Then we have our section where the events are being set with the SP trace set event procedure. And this is why no one ever creates this manually, because you specify that trace ID variable, and then you have to specify the event ID and the column ID. And I, having presented this, I don't know how many times, have commented this because I still don't remember, right? So 10 means RPC completed, and 1 is text data. So SP trace set event RPC completed text data. And I have one of these for every event column combination. So I have this for RPC completed, and then I have everything for SQL statement completed. And then we've got our filter, which we've got two. One is the default component, which is filtering out profiler, and the other is the filter that we created, SP trace set filter reads greater than or equal to 10,000. And then the last thing that happens is the trace is started. This one means start this trace ID and display that to be when we're finished. So if I run this right here, we get a trace ID of 2. The default trace almost always has a trace ID of 1. It's up and run unless you've turned that off for some reason, and then it's not running. And if I want to see what is running, I can use fn trace get info, and I have trace ID 1. Again, this is the default trace, and trace ID 2 is the one that we've created. Now, this was really, really easy to get to here. So how do we take this and how do we go to extended events? Well, what's really easy to do is to start the trace that we are used to running and then run this stored procedure, which is called SQL Skills Convert Trace to Extended Events. So this is something that Jonathan wrote one time on an airplane, actually because he was bored, and it converts a trace to the extended events code. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this. If you love to geek out on that, then I definitely encourage you to do that. But if we scroll down here, right, we're going to see all of these different events listed. And I've already created this stored procedure. So all we have to do to generate the code is run this stored procedure for a trace that is defined and or running. So we know that our trace is running. It has a trace ID of 2. Our event session that we want to create, we're going to name XE reads filter trace. We want it to print the output so we can see it, but I don't want it to execute that. So we'll go ahead and run this. And the output that comes up, I can copy this, right? I can put it into another window. And now I have the event session code. Now, just as with my trace code, I have a version of this that I've commented, and I'm going to close this one and open the other one because I want to show you the two of them side by side. This is where I was really able to go, oh, I see. So I'm hoping that that's going to help for all of you. So on the left, we have our trace code. We'll start right up there. And on our right is our event session code. Now, the event session code starts with a check to see if the event session already exists, and if so, it drops it. So this is something extra that John put in. We're just going to go past that. So here's where we start for extended events, and on the left, this is where we start with the trace. So a little bit different over here on the right, we have create event session, the name of the event session on server, because just as with the trace, the event sessions are instance specific. And beneath that, we start with an add event. So here's where we deviate a bit. We first had for our trace side, SP trace create and the location to which we're going to write the file. So just hold that for a second and instead come down here. So here, this section right here was where we set, again, our event column combinations. And on the right side, we are setting our events as well as our actions. Now, one of the things that I like is that I can see what the event is immediately. I don't have to reference books online to know what an ID is. It tells me this is the RPC completed event. SQL Server, by the way, that precedes that is the package to which that event belongs to. So add event, RPC completed, and then I have a list of actions. Now, here's a big difference. When you look at these actions on the right and you compare them to the event column combinations on the left, you'll notice that it's not a one-to-one relationship because on the right, these are actions. And here's a fundamental difference. I'm going to hop back to Profiler and I want to come into this definition and the events. Did you know that when I select show all columns, I have the columns that are checked and then I have a bunch of other columns. Did you know that trace collects all of these columns that are available for the event when the event fires. And then it looks to see what you've checked, and it keeps that and it tosses out the rest, which is one reason it has more over, because it's collecting all the things that are available and then saying, oh, you don't need that, let me throw it away. Extended events is different. Extended events has something called a default payload for every event. So we don't see here for RPC completed, we don't see duration, we don't see reads, we don't see writes or CPU, because those are part of the default payload. The things we do see are not part of the default payload, so those are actions. An action is something additional I want to be collected. So also please collect client app name and client PID and database ID and service instance ID, which means that extended events is more efficient because it captures, it pulls in as part of the default payload what is immediately available. And then if that isn't sufficient for us, we can use actions, which means the more actions I have, the more overhead I have. So when I convert a trace to an extended event session, I'd encourage you to look at this and say, do I really need server instance name? I probably know what instance I'm running this on, unless I'm doing something where I'm aggregating data across instances, right? Then I might need that. But otherwise, I probably don't need that. Do I need session ID? Maybe if I'm troubleshooting, but otherwise, I don't know that I really need that. So think about that when you're looking at your actions. Below my actions, I have my predicate, my where clause, my filter. And on the left, we had our filters here. Filter out profiler, filter only for reads greater than or equal to 10,000. I love this predicate because I can read it. Where logical reads greater than or equal to 10,000. And you'll notice that all of this is contained for this event for RPC completed. And then I have my add event SQL statement completed, and it's the same, but it doesn't have to be, right? I could say, I don't want those two. And maybe for my where clause here, I actually say database ID equals 5. They don't have, my actions and my predicates absolutely do not need to be the same for my different events. So this is very powerful. And then at the bottom, I have my target. So if you remember, I said, hold the thought up here with my location. So at the beginning in trace with SP trace create, I specified my location. At the end of my event session, I have my target. Where do I want my data to go? So to make this analogous to my trace, we are going to write out to a file called an event file. And we specify our file name, and we specify the max file size, just like we did, and how many rollover files I want. And when I'm happy with this, when I've created this, I go ahead and say execute. Now, a little bit different, that creates the event session. It does not start it. What started my event, what started my trace over here was SP trace set status. And so I'm going to make a quick change here before I go any further, because I don't want to worry for this demo about creating queries that have reads greater than or equal to 10,000. So I'm going to stop that trace, and I'm going to remove the existing definition. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to comment out this filter and rerun that. Ooh, I love it when this happens. So could not create trace file because many of you have seen this before and know immediately what's going on, because this trace file already exists. This is something that annoys the heck out of me, I admit. So this file already exists. So I can either rename it, delete it, or create a different file name here, but we just delete it and fix that. Now over here, I had my predicate, and I'm just going to comment it out for both of these. And I will run this again because remember I had my drop and create down here. So let me go ahead and run that. I'm going to close both of these, not saving my changes. And I'm going to open up one more script for this demo, which is, let's see what exists at this point. So fn trace get info, which we've seen before, and then server event sessions. And I have 4 event sessions and I have 2 traces. We've looked at these before, right? Default trace is at the top for trace ID 1, and we've got our trace for 2. here we have 3 system event sessions. And what you see here will depend on your version. So system health is an event session that has been there since 2008. It writes out both to the ring buffer and to a file, an event file, which you would find in your log folder where you have your error log files, where you have your trace files. Always on health is only going to be running if you have an availability group. And telemetry X events is only going to be running if you've left telemetry enabled. If you've turned that off, then you will not have that running. And this is the one I created, XC reads filter trace. So we have to start our event session. Our default trace is, or excuse me, the trace that we created is running, but our event session is not. So we'll go ahead and start that. And then let me flip to run my workload real quick, which is these queries. Oh, hi, let's run with right click and run PowerShell. Also, I am not a PowerShell wizard. I have stolen all of these from Jonathan with his permission. I have modified them slightly. It kind of is like XQuery to me, honestly. So those are both running. Fabulous. Now, if I want to look at what's running right now, I have a slightly different set of queries. I'm still hitting server event sessions, but now I'm going to join over to DMXE sessions. And rather than using my function, I'm going to query sys traces to see what I get and what's actively running. So I don't have an always on availability group. So this is not running. I do have telemetry enabled. So telemetry is running, system health is running, my event session is running. And then I have default trace and my trace running as well. So I let them go for however long I want to capture data, right? Those scripts are running. And once I've let it run for however long, I'm going to stop my event session and I'm going to stop my trace. Now, at this point, when I do this, I'm no longer collecting any data, but the definitions for both of these still exist. But I would be willing to bet that most folks go to the next step and they delete the trace definition. And if you happen not to, when you restart the instance, that trace definition will be removed for you. Here's a fundamental difference with extended events that I really, really love. So let's expand this and let's zoom in and take a look at this. This is where I want to make your life easier. Oh, I am not John Madden. Some of you might be too young to remember John Madden. But we have our event sessions right here, and we have the event session that we created, XE reads filter trace. And this sits there and it persists through restarts. Now I can create a template in extended events just like I could in trace, but I can create the event session and leave it here. As a consultant, I sometimes have the ability to do this. For my remote DBA customers that I'm in their systems on a regular basis, as I create event sessions for different problems, different issues, I leave them there. And I just leave them in an off state and I turn them on if I need them again. Otherwise, I have to create them for my customers as I'm troubleshooting an issue. But if you are a DBA or an administrator or developer, you can create these event sessions and just leave them. You can export them and make them part of your default deployment for SQL Server for different versions. So I know you're used to your templates and you can still create templates in extended events, but you can create the event sessions and leave them there, which means all I have to do to start it is right click and start, which is so cool in my opinion. Now, I am going to go ahead and remove them. So I'm going to drop the event session. I'm going to take it away. And then I am going to remove my trace definition as well. So let me there's some questions out here that I want to take a look, I want to answer before I go into looking at the data. So Daniel said, are there new packages with new events that we can download? So anything that's new is actually built into the extended events engine and you get. So there's nothing to download, but events correspond to points of interest in the SQL Server code. So as new features are added or as they come out with CUs, there are sometimes new events. And you'll see when I show you the list of events per edition that the number of events keeps increasing. Dan says, I also struggle with the new names of events and filters versus the profiler names. Okay, let me show you something and maybe you can help me understand. What's a challenge for you? So this is a query that looks at the trace events against the extended events names. And it excludes audit events. I'll talk about that later. Right? So there's some events that were in trace that are not in extended events. But here are all of the events from trace and the corresponding event in extended events. So this query, Dan, might help you to map between what you've been used to and what we have here. So if you have a further question, let me know. With regard to the filters, we'll talk about that when we look at the UI. Ricky says, is there a target trace of table? No. And I'm okay with that, quite frankly, because there's a ton of overhead with writing to the table. You can still push the data to the table. I'll show you that in a second. Oh, sorry, I should have kept reading. Daniel always already answered that. Most of my X queries have been stolen from Jonathan. Me too. I'll send him something. I'm like, help, how do I get this out? So he's one of my most favorite people in the world for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that he knows X query. I have no problem admitting that. Okay. Now we want to look at, I adore him for other reasons. It's not just that. But it doesn't hurt, you know? So now we're going to look at our file. So this is not going to open in here. I have to go this way. So annoying. Here we go. So this is the view that we know and love. Or actually, I look at this and I was like, oh, like I have so many memories of looking at this data and then like scrolling through and try to find a problem. How many of you have done this, right? You scroll and then you're like, oh, this one. Okay, it is line 464. Let me write that down because I might need to come back with that. So this UI is so clunky. I can drag columns around, right? That's kind of fun. I can search in here, right? I'm looking for, let's say, product ID and text data. I can find that, but I really can't do a lot with that data. And I would guess what a lot of you would do is save this as a trace table and push this into a table in a database and then do your thing. Or I understand the ease of that, but I would totally recommend if you're still using trace, and I say using trace, those of you who are on SQL Server 2008 R2, which you shouldn't be because it went out of support, but I know that it's not always easy to shift off of that. So if you still are, my recommendation is that you use a third-party tool such as ReadTrace or your fellow user group member, Bill Graziano's tool, ClearTrace. ClearTrace, I prefer. It has such a small footprint, and those allow you to slice and dice the data multiple ways, including it replaces literal parameters and allows you to aggregate based on most frequently executed queries, which is a lot harder to do when there's literal values in there. So those two tools are what I would recommend. But with extended events, we don't have those tools and we don't need those tools because we have the UI. So those of you on Server 2012 and higher, I strongly recommend looking to use extended events. And here's the file that we created. And you'll notice that we had named our file XE-reads filtered trace, but there are all these numbers appended to the file. And that number represents the number of seconds from January 1st. I can't even remember the number. I want to say 1700, but that might be wrong. Some old date, long before we were born, till the current time, which means that that number is ever increasing. So the files are always uniquely named. So I don't ever have to worry about having a file out there and replacing it or renaming it. SQL Server handles that for me, which I really like. So let's open up that file and see what it looks like. And on first view, I'll tell you, this is really not that interesting, right? Because we look here and it's like, what's so fascinating here? Well, by default, when extended events files get opened in Management Studio doesn't know what events are in there. So it shows you the columns which exist for every event, which is name and timestamp. But down below in the details pane, what you see is the additional payload or actions that we collected. So to make this more interesting, And what we're used to is I can right click on each of these. Let's look at right, and then we'll look at our statement. So I can add the columns that are interesting to me, and I can make this look like Profiler. And even better than that, I don't have to choose those columns every time. Like if I run this a lot, I can save these settings, and I can call it my favorite view setting 2 or whatever I want to call it. And I can share it with my friends. So if I create this event session and I look at this and do some analysis, not do I only just send the file to people, but I can send that display setting to them, and they can open up the file and then open up the display setting file and see the same view. And in here, I can do the same thing where I drag columns around, but I can also sort. So if I wanted to sort based on, oh, I thought I added duration. Note, I keep doing right click, show column and table, but across the top, this is my extended events toolbar right here across the top. And I can go to choose columns and I can say, oh, I meant to add duration. Let's move that up. Okay. And now I could sort by duration. So I can right click, or I can just click on it once, but I can say sort descending. And now I'll have the columns sorted in descending order based on duration. Now, Danielle had said before, I get confused between microseconds and milliseconds. And the reason there's confusion there is because not every duration value is microseconds. Not every duration value is milliseconds. You actually have to look at the event to know for sure. And the easiest way to do that is in the UI. So when we get to the UI, I'll point that out. But I can sort within here. I can also filter. So let's pretend that I only want to see things that are a duration greater than 1 millisecond. So I say, okay, and this is going to filter down. And you'll notice right here that it now says displaying 1138 out of 7,800, right? So it's filtered out those events. I also have the ability to search within the text. So my filter would allow me to reduce the result set there. And then I also can do something cool like an aggregation. So if I wanted to look at duration and say, well, what is the, I didn't want to do that. Hang on. I don't want to group by. That's another cool thing I can do, but I don't want to do that. So let me take that grouping out. But let me explain what grouping does. If I group by the event name, I can see which events are RPC completed and which events are SQL statement completed. So I could group by name, or I could group by database ID, right, to get all of the events based on that column together. If I want to ungroup, I just come in here and remove that grouping. But in terms of the aggregation, so I can look at duration, and I can, why am I not seeing calculate aggregation? Come on. Let me go up. Here we go. Aggregation. Oh, because I have to group it first, of course. Fine. Let me group by database ID because they're all database ID 5. So once I've grouped here, now I can say, okay, all my queries for database ID 5, give me the average duration. Now I can only calculate one of these at a time, one aggregation at a time. If I wanted to do more in terms of analysis, and I really believe that the UI is a really good start, but if I wanted to do more, I can come up to my extended events menu and I can say export to, and I can push this out to a table. And then I can write my queries against the table. Or I can save it out to a CSV file. So I'm going to pause. Let me see if I have any different. Okay, answer that. Ernesto had a question. Yes, Russell, thank you. Clear trace. I don't know if it's 1970. For some reason, I think it's 1700. Hang on. I'm gonna give you a second to see if you have any other questions before I hop back. Not yet. Okay, I'm assuming everybody's good. If not, holler. So let's look at the events for a little bit. Let's just go through these different things that we've talked about and make sure that we've got the understanding of what each component is. So the event, as I said, corresponds to a well-known point in the code. So some examples: data file auto grow, a sort warning, object created, statement completed, RPC, statement completed, lock acquired, statement recompile, deadlock graph. And every event has a default payload, some set of elements that are always returned, and you can't alter that. So I can't say for SP statement completed, don't collect duration. You don't have the ability to do that. So I showed you the query that you can use to compare the event and trace to extended events. Here's an example. I think that the naming is pretty good, right? SP statement completed becomes SP underscore statement underscore completed. Data file auto grows a little tricky. There were a couple events that were like a data file grow and a log file grow, and then they stopped using those, and you should use database file size changed instead. And that differentiates between whether it's a data file growth or a log file growth. And I have audit login at the bottom with login crossed out because in SQL Server 2012, this is the version where every event that exists in trace has a corresponding event in extended events. So my recommendation is that you don't use extended events until 2012. And that's the version where Jonathan's script is first supported. And understand that Trace's ability to do audits is not in extended events, because in 2012, they moved audit to the audit feature. So if you want to audit in 2012 or higher, you should either still be using Trace or you should be using the audit feature. And if you see an event in extended events that looks like an audit event, it is not. So login in extended events is not the same as audit login in Trace. And in that script I showed you, it noted when it was an audit event. So the names are similar. Everything has the comparable except for audit events. And this script uses that trace XE event map to see how to map those events. And here's the number of events by version. So again, as new code is added to SQL Server and events are there to correspond to the points of interest, you see the number of events increasing. So right now we're at the rate of 200 to 300 new events per release. And I don't know if you noticed, but there's only 180 trace events in each of the versions. So the number of trace events has not increased. And if you want to do any troubleshooting or any digging because you find something interesting for any new feature, for column store, for query store, for buffer pool extension, for in-memory OLTP, for availability groups, you can only use extended events. There's none of those events being ported back to trace. Now, our predicates are our filters, our where clauses. That determines whether or not the event is going to fire. And they're very powerful because they support short circuit evaluation. And let me show you what I mean by that, because again, me being a visual person, I think it's a lot more interesting and helpful to look at that. So I'm going to zoom in here really big on this predicate right here. So I want to talk about the short circuit whatever the word is, short circuit evaluation. So let's pretend that I have multiple databases on my instance, and database ID 5 is my busiest database, but I have like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have a bunch of others out there. And I'm going to do some troubleshooting, and I want to specifically look at database ID 5. And I'm interested in queries against database ID 5 that have greater than 100,000 reads, not 10,000, but 100,000. So my predicate could be written one of two ways. I could say logical reads greater than equal to 10,000 and database ID is 5, right? So this is how I could write this. And the way that predicate evaluation occurs for extended events is it goes through and it says, are my logical reads for this RPC completed event greater than or equal to 100,000? No. Done. It doesn't evaluate database ID. Next query. Are my logical reads greater than equal to 10,000? No. Doesn't evaluate database ID. Next query. Are my logical reads greater than or equal to 100,000? Yes. Is my database ID 5? Yes. You win, right? So only if logical reads greater than 100,000 evaluates to true, does it look at the database ID predicate. Now imagine instead we had this, right? Database ID 5, come on over, and logical reads equal to 1,000. Here, my query would come in. It would say, is my database ID 5? And because the majority of the queries on this instance are database ID 5, I'm going to get yes. Logical reads greater than 100,000? No, don't capture. Database ID 5? Yes. Logical reads greater than 100,000? No. Database ID 5? Yes. Logical reads greater than 100,000? No. So there's more work that has to be done when I put database ID 5 first. That is less efficient. I really want to put logical reads first because it is more selective. It is less likely to be true, which means that it short circuits evaluation. So think about what is most unique and what's going to drop out first, right? What's going to stop evaluation first? That's what I want to do in an and scenario. If it's an or scenario, that's different. So here, it could be, is my database ID 5 or are my logical reads greater than 100,000? Now, this is probably a lot of data. So maybe I think that database ID 8 is a problem. So I might switch this up a little bit, right? So database ID 8, no, yeah, I'm gonna keep it that way, right? So database ID 8, so it's gonna say, is it database ID 8? Yep. Don't even look at logical reads because it's already evaluated to true. So the moment in an or scenario that it evaluates to true, it's done. It doesn't have to evaluate any further. So if it's database ID 8, yep, logical reads greater than 100,000, doesn't even have to look at it. Database ID greater than 8, no, logical reads greater than 100,000, then it's a yes. Right? So you really have to think about the predicate evaluation, and you can, and by the way, these can get really complex, right? I just did 2, right? This and this. But then I could also do or, right? Just to be fun, I can take this and I can do this, or database ID equals 10 and something else here, right? 1,000,000, right? So this can get really, really complicated and complex, which is cool, but then you really have to think about this. And I really prefer, I recommend looking at this here in the T-SQL versus in the UI because you can understand the logic much better. I would need to close paren here, wouldn't I? So this is interesting. So Eddie's question is always put the most restrictive predicate first. If you're doing an and, yes. If you're doing an or, the other way around. Then you want to say whatever is going to evaluate to true first, put that first. So I really hope that I don't have a lot of logical reads greater than 100,000. So I'm betting on I have more queries against database ID equals 8 than against this. If I were doing database ID 5, right, this would occur much more often. So I would put database ID 5 first as opposed to logical reads. But it depends on whether I'm doing an and or an or for what I put first. Okay, so my predicates in this case, by the way, are going against, right? I have database ID, which is an action. I'm sorry. Database ID is an action, but database ID is also a global predicate source, which is different than an action. And logical reads is part of my default payload. So for my predicate, I can predicate against something that's part of the default payload, or I can predicate against something that is a global predicate source. And sometimes that can be confusing because a global predicate source means it's available to any event, it's globally available as a predicate. And the global predicate sources are different than my actions, even though they might have the same name. So there are 2 different entities within extended events. So again, my predicates, right, are filters, which can be on my payload data or my global predicate sources here. And again, my last note here is just that the global predicates can have the same name as actions, but they're two different entities. And speaking of actions, actions are needed when the default payload isn't enough. So it's an additional operation that's performed. Go collect the database ID, go collect the session ID. And there's some that are kind of powerful, which is create a mini dump for the current thread, or create a full dump, or do a debug. So most of the time the actions are just like collect additional information, but there are some that have extreme overhead. And an action executes only when predicate evaluation goes to true. And Daniel said, is it better to use the global predicate instead of the action? So I wasn't very clear there, and I apologize. There is no action predicate. It's just that my actions here can have the same name as my predicates, but these are actually two different entities. So you can only ever use a global predicate source. Okay, you can never, you don't filter on an action. An action is an additional operation. Go collect that information. They just happen to have the same name, which can be a little bit confusing. So again, actions only execute when the when the predicate evaluates to true. My targets, where am I going to write the data? So we've looked at event file. And that is a quote unquote permanent target, all right, until you delete the file. So if you want to capture data and retain it to review later or to share with your friends, that's what you want to use. The ring buffer, the event counter, the histogram, and the event pairing targets are all memory targets, which means that once I stop the event session, then I no longer have that information. So you either have to pull that out yourself with xquery, or in some cases you can save it out, like copy and paste it into Excel or something like that. So if you want to keep it, you need to go to the event file. But one thing that's really cool about extended events is that you can write to more than one target. So I sometimes write to the event file as well as event pairing or the histogram. The event counter is just, let me count how many events occur. And event counter, you think, well, why would I just want to count the events that occur? And the reason is because sometimes you don't know a workload. Sometimes I hop into a system and I don't know how busy it is or it isn't. So before I actually run the event session I want to run, I'll run it just as a counter so I can see how many events there are. So here's a little diagram to understand the order of events. If my event is encountered, if I hit SP completed, is enabled equal true? Am I capturing this event? If so, move along in collection mode, which means collect my payload data, the information that's available by default, and then perform predicate evaluation. And if my predicate evaluates to true, then I want you to publish that event. And once you publish the event, execute those actions to collect additional data, and then push that data to my synchronous targets. So up till here, this all happens on the same thread where the event fired. So if I'm a user and I'm running a query and that is a statement completed, and I'm running that on a thread and we're collecting statement completed, then all of this happens on my thread and I'm waiting for this to finish. It's pretty fast. I don't even notice it usually. But if it's a high volume system and I have lots of people doing statement completed and I don't have a great filter or any filter, that's where you can sometimes introduce overhead. So on that same thread, that data gets pushed either to my synchronous targets or my asynchronous targets. And the synchronous target is the event counter. All the rest of them are asynchronous. So ring buffer, event file, histogram, event pairing are all asynchronous targets, which means that before it actually goes to that target, it goes to some memory buffers. Those hold that data, and that's specific to each event session that you create, and then they are dispatched to the target. And that happens on a different thread. So at this point, the thread goes back to whatever the user is doing next, right? So everything happens synchronously there. But here, sorry, it happens in order there to the synchronous or async target. Once we get here, that asynchronous takes over. Another thread is sitting there, and when those buffers fill up, or when the dispatch latency's been hit, then it goes out to our target. So I'm going to hop into another demo. Any questions before I do that? All right. So let's look at the UI, because at some point, what's hopefully going to happen is you're not just going to be creating event sessions based upon your trace thing. You're going to say, well, hey, I can start creating new event sessions. And I totally agree. So if we come in here to our sessions, I'm going to right click and I'm going to select new session. You'll notice I also have new session wizard. I want new session. I don't get as many options with the wizard. I just don't love using it. So we're going to come in here to new session. And this is going to load. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enter an event session name. So we're going to call this DBAs. And then I do have templates. So just like in extended events, I have templates that I can create, and I can create my different template groups. And again, make this part of my default build. So there's options just like I had before. I have a bunch of other options I didn't have before for my event session. The first is start the event session at server startup. So my system health event session has this option checked, which means every time the instance starts, start this event session, and it's going to run until the instance stops. So that's kind of cool. I don't have to create a job that does that, or do something to make it start up on startup. It'll happen automatically. Then do I want to look at the event session right after I create it? And do I want to watch live data? And then there's this cool option of causality tracking. In Trace, if you ever had to add, say, session ID or SPID back in the day, right? Transaction ID, tried to add a bunch of columns in there to try to correlate what happened by what thread in what order. You don't have to do that anymore because causality tracking does it for you. So it attaches a GUID and a sequence number to events, so you can see which events are related based on the GUID and then what order they happened in based on the sequence number. So that's kind of cool. And you know what? I'm going to change this. I'm going to call this track queries because that's more fun. Then we come into our events. And in here in our event library, this is something that I love. Because remember in Profiler, when you would come in here and you would come into your events and you'd say, show all of your events. And why aren't I seeing all my events? I don't know, but let's start a new trace just to make it easier, because this is what I would do, right? Start a new trace, come in here, events, show all my events, and then I'd be like, okay, that's not it. Where is the event? I can't be the only one that did this, right? That would scroll looking for your event. So annoying. I wasted hours of my life doing that. Here, I can just type completed and oh, look, right? Now I have all of the events that have the completed text in there. And by default, it only searches in my event names. So if I wanted to look for something like CheckDB, notice that I only get one event here. But if I change this to say all and do it again, oh, come on, there. Now I get things, actually I cheated, I changed it to check, didn't I? Now I get things that have it not just in the name, but also in the text. Let me do that, check DB. Still gives me one. Oh, I know why, because by default, I'm also not seeing the debug events. So when I change that, or it's DBCC, there we go, right? So check face tracing does not have DBCC in the event name, but it shows up in the description. So I can change not just where I am searching, but also the type of event. So the debug events are not selected by default, and there's no way to make them selected by default. And typically you don't need them, but sometimes you want to dig in, and you do want to enable that channel so that you can see it. But we're going to look at some completed events. We are going to go to, oh, this is what happens when I leave it at all. I only want event names. We're going to look at SQL statement completed and SP statement completed. So we'll highlight this and we'll push it over in the middle and statement completed and move that over. And then I need to configure my events. And I've heard some complaints that this window is a little bit more complex than Profiler because I can't do everything right here. And that's because our event sessions are just more complex than they were. And there's so many events and we have so many additional options that it doesn't fit gracefully on one screen. So we hit configure and we slide on over here. And so now on my left, I have the different events. And if I go all the way to the right to my event fields, you'll notice that if I click on the different events, I get different event fields. So this is my default payload right here on the right. So it's slightly different per event. And then I have my filter, right? So I could click on both of these. And this version is just killing me. But I can click on both events and I can say, okay, we are going to filter on, let's just say duration greater than 100. And notice down here at the bottom that it says the time in microseconds. So this here is time in microseconds that it took. So that's how that helps me understand value. So this isn't very much. If I change this to 1000, then that means everything greater than 1 millisecond is what I will capture here. And if I look here at my duration, it tells me for the default payload that this is showing in microseconds as well. So you're gonna need to use that information. So I've only got one filter on there. We'll go with that. And then I have my global, my actions, right? What additional information do I want it to collect? So we are going to say that we also want to collect, for example, database ID. That's it. Now, where do we want the data to go? This is data storage is basically our target. So I'm going to go ahead and say, event file. And this is going to write out to the event file location. And by default, there's no path in here in later versions, which means it's going to write to the log folder where your error log is, where system health is. And I'm going to drop that into temp health, or excuse me, into the temp folder instead. Max file size, I typically set to 256 megs. There's a limit that you can only view 1 million events within the UI, within Management Studio. And it's hard to predict the size of the events. You could go and do some math. Actually, that would make a good blog post. But in lieu of doing that, I just say, I don't want a file that's any larger than 256 megs because I don't want it caching as I start scrolling through it. I do enable file rollover and I set a max number of files. So let's say that I only wanted to allocate or for my files to only consume 2 gigs of space, then I would set this to 8. And once it had 8 files, and if it were continuing to collect data, it would roll over back to that first one, ensuring that I only have 8 files here. The advanced tab I'm not going to hit today. The defaults are typically pretty good. If you have a high volume system, you might change something, particularly in regard to memory partition. So we'll go ahead and say okay at this point. And again, it creates my event session, but it doesn't start it. In order to start it, I'm going to right click and select start session. But before I do that, because I just kind of was winging this, I'm going to make sure that I created the event session that I wanted. So what did I want? SQL statement completed. Database ID, yes, I didn't collect client app name. Oh, the filter that I used here was making sure it's not a system query. So I kind of changed that up a little bit. But let's go ahead and recreate that. So I'm just changing my filter. I'm getting rid of my seconds filter. And let's see, I also did my target event file. And I also did a ring buffer target. So let's alter my event session on the server. And I'm going to start it up. And let's run a little workload here. So this will be here. So let's go ahead and run this with PowerShell, make sure all these fire up. Oh, I love it when I don't run things in advance. So go. I know there's a way to fix this, and those of you that know PowerShell are like, really, Erin? And I'm like, yeah, really. That's me right there. So now we've started our workload. And this is where it gets fun. So let's see. Here, if I look at this, where's my query ring buffer in a separate window? Sometimes I change up my scripts, which I did here, and that's okay. Target. Should be in here. Oh, you know what? I didn't put a space in here, right? I don't think I did. This VM is not that happy. I'm okay with that. There we go. So what I can see here is that my ring buffer has about 6,000 events processed, but the number of events in the ring buffer is only 1,000 because part of the ring buffer default is that I only see those 1,000. And I'm going to go ahead and stop these for 1 second because that's really putting some load on my VM. So I can see how many these events here by parsing that ring buffer. And remember that X query that I said I didn't love? Boom, right there. Jonathan wrote this and I just, changed my target, changed my event session to make it work. But this query shows me exactly what's in the ring buffer. And the ring buffer, you'll notice I run this query again and my number of events processed has changed. It's a first in, first out queue. So the default is that I only see 1,000 events. So it's whatever 1,000 events are in there, which is really not historically accurate in terms of what's been captured. The better thing or the better way to look at that data is to either look at that event file session that I've created, or if I want to get a profiler-like view, what I can do is say, watch live data. Now, right now, I'm not running any scripts, so I'm not going to see anything come in here. But the moment that I fire up these scripts again, so let's go ahead and run this. I shouldn't have to click yes on every one of these now because I did. Oh, you got to be killing me. Come on. There we go. So now this is, by the way, that profiler-like view that you're used to. So now I see queries streaming in. And the thing about this view is it will disconnect if the overhead is too much. So if streaming the data here into the live data viewer introduces too much overhead, it will disconnect automatically. So here I can see what's going on. And if I just want to do some analysis here, I can actually stop this feed. Now my workload is still running. Information is still being captured out to the event file, but I could stop and do some analysis here. Let me stop this query. I don't want to run that. I don't need it right now. So I've got a lot going on right here, right? Here's the data that I've collected through the live viewer. I've gone ahead and paused this just so that I can capture information. I could look at this and I could say, you know what, this is going to work. I really don't need that ring buffer. So I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of changes. And I can alter my event session on the fly. If you remember, when I had my trace, if I wanted to modify anything, I had to stop that and restart it. But I can actually come in here and I can look at the properties of my event session and I can make changes right here on the fly. So let's say that I decided, okay, I really don't need the ring buffer at this point. I'm going to get rid of it. So I can go to data storage and I can remove that as my target. Now, I seriously I don't not know why my machine is so unhappy today, but that's okay. It's more like real life, right? So I've removed that target on the fly. Boom. I can also do this through T-SQL. I'm just going to go ahead and let that finish in the background, where I can alter my event sessions with the T-SQL, and I can drop the events. And what you might notice here is that when I look at these, right, I can easily filter based upon my duration, right? Or I can base upon my logical reads, right? And I say that this is looking for what I call my heavy hitters, right? The things that consume a lot of IO or duration or CPU. But sometimes I want to look at my death by 1,000 cuts. And sometimes this is easy because if you look at this right here, right, we can see that this query is exactly the same. And it has a variable in here, which means that if I right click on statement and I do a group by, then I can group by this data really easily. But notice that some of these queries have literal values. And so this query right here in the middle, these 4 queries are exactly the same, but because they have different literal values, they show up as 4 separate queries. So in this manner, I can't effectively understand my death by 1,000 cuts. This is where Bill Graziano's clear trace tool and retrace were great for trace because it would replace those literal values with a parameter and it would do that grouping and you could find the death by 1,000 cuts. So how do we do that in extended events? Well, I have a solution for that, which is we come back in here to our research window and we say, I'm going to, back into my track queries window. And we're going to drop both of those events for the moment. So this is kind of fun because my event session's running, but right now I've taken the events out of it, so it's not capturing anything. But I don't have to stop and restart. I could, I don't have to. But I'm going to add both of those events back. And this time, I'm also including my query hash and my query plan hash. If you remember, those two were added in SQL Server 2008, and they are the query fingerprints. So those uniquely identify a query. And those that have the same literal value have the same query hash. So if I start this again, whatever was in my viewer is gone. But remember, everything was being captured in the event file. So I don't have to worry about that. I'm not missing anything. Everything exists out in that event file. So we'll let some more data come in here. And now you'll see that on the right, query hash and query plan hash are being populated. And we have, again, these queries that have parameters, but we also have our literal queries in here as well. So if I stop this for a second, right, and I come in here to this output, we can, let's just scroll through here before I do some grouping. Here is an example of my query. And let me stop my workload because I don't need this anymore and it is definitely slowing me down. But here is my example of my query hash and my literal value. So product ID equals 97, and I have my query hash and I have my query plan hash. So I'm just gonna copy this guy. Can I copy the cell here? You betcha. And then I'm going to group by, right? I'm gonna group by that value. So what was that value? Because I can't remember anything anymore. So 7334. So I grouped by my query hash. Oh, look, right? 7334. So here, all of these queries, even though they have a different literal value, they have the same query hash. And fun enough, we have 3 different query plan hashes. So this query even though it's all the same, we end up generating at least 3 different plans for it. So this is another great way to troubleshoot and to look at your workload and understand what's going on, and understand a parameter sensitive query and think about, does it make sense to parameterize this? And if I do, am I okay with different plans that I get? Are those good for everything? What I want to plan force if I'm using Query Store? So much opportunity for understanding your workload. And I do all of this. I can look at all of this right here in the UI. So what questions do you have about the UI? And what concerns might you have? How does it decide when to disconnect? How much workload is too much? Andrew, that's a great question. I don't have anywhere that it's documented that it says when it exceeds X amount, right? That's an internally determined threshold where it says it's the overhead. I've seen it happen one time. I have a screenshot of it somewhere. It was from a customer production environment where it just disconnected. And when that happens to me, it's a suggestion that I either need to not look at the live data, or maybe I need to revisit my filter because it's not restrictive enough. So it's important to remember that even with extended events, you can bring down a system. I think it was much easier with Profiler, but there are still some events within extended events that are very expensive. And let me show you a couple of those. Some of you may be familiar with your capture actual execution plan. And if we look in here and we look at, actually I should say show plan. If I could spell. See, I still do type in demos, right? So if we look at post execution show plan and we zoom in on this, you will see using this event can have significant performance overhead. So it should only be used when troubleshooting. So I have seen cases where this has severely degraded performance. In fact, there was a third-party monitoring tool that for a time captured this event, and we discovered it enabled in a customer environment, and it significantly affected that customer production's workload. In terms of the overhead of Profiler compared to Trace, there is a article that Jonathan did. I'm just trying to pull this up here, bring this over here. So this is out on SQL Performance. If you Google Cahias, if you can spell it, you know how I remember this? K-E, hay, H-A-Y, like the hay, you know, that horses eat, and then I-A-S. That's how I remember. And I say it every time, K-hay-I-S, every time, but it's Cahias, just so you know. Anyway, Jonathan did the test where he did replay, and he's got a baseline, server-side trace, profiler, extended events. And if you look at the overhead here, I don't have the zoom on, but this is the one that shows you, right? Batch requests per second. So at the bottom here is profiler. So like 250 batch requests per second. And running that same workload with extended events up here is up in the 2000, anywhere between, I don't know what, 1700, 2500. So the overhead is significant between Profiler, the UI, and extended events. And notice that Trace, which is the purple, is somewhat comparable to extended events. Extended events goes a little bit better up here, but Trace, server-side Trace, is much better than Profiler. Okay. Any other questions about the UI? Okay, I'm going to show you something else. I have a couple slides about this, but again, I like the visual. And something to mention. So I'm going to actually open, I have Management Studio 17. I'm going to go back to an older version of Management Studio because I got something a little wonky in this one. So this is 17.9. The other one was 18 point something. Let me connect here. Let me look at my event session definition again under extended events. Come on back here. data storage. Nope, advanced. That's what I want. Here we go. So you'll notice here that I have a limitation in terms of the max memory. And so that is the max memory size for those buffers, those intermediate buffers for my asynchronous targets. I usually set this to something like 16 megs. And I recommend that you set a limit here. And I also want to mention that if you write out to the ring buffer target, you'll notice when we had looked at that ring buffer target before, we had this default of 1,000 events to keep. Now, you may not know how many events you want to keep, and you might say, well, I'm going to set this to 0. Well, the thing is you can't have both of those set to 0. It doesn't let you do that. So it tells you right here, right? For the ring buffer, max events is invalid, right? Either one of these, either max memory or max events limit must be set to a value different than 0. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to set, because I don't know how much space this is going to consume, and I don't know how many events I want. I'm going to set my max buffer size to really, really large value, right? Like 100 gigs. And does it let me do this? No, right? It says it's invalid. So I have to set this something to a little lower. But if I set this to a value that is higher than the amount of memory that I have on the server, then theoretically, extended events can consume all of the memory available, which means I can't bring data into the buffer pool, which means I've affected the plan cache. So that's not good. So if you use the ring buffer target, you want to make sure that you set either the max memory size to a reasonable value, or you set the number of events to a reasonable value. So that's something to pay attention to when you do that. So again, performance is something that you have to think about, right? So certain events are expensive. If you filter on global state data as opposed to your default payload, that's more expensive. And adding my actions adds overhead. So what actions do I really need? And some of those have side effects, like performing a dump or inserting a debug break. So I only use those really at the direction of Microsoft, or if I'm in a test or dev environment messing around. There are other actions which have a little bit higher overhead because of that action and the size of it, and how many times that event fires. So that's something to consider as well. And again, if you're using the ring buffer target, make sure that you set a limit with the max amount of memory consumed. And that's gotten better in later versions of SQL Server. Earlier on, it was easier to make a mistake there. So I've hopefully addressed all of those initial concerns. If I missed something, please let me know now. But for those of you who are looking at this and thinking, I'll tell you right now what you're not going to love, because this is what I didn't love initially. If you go back this afternoon and you're going to try to use extended events, at first you're going to be a little bit frustrated because you're like, this just takes longer. And it does, right? Because you're learning something new. I like to compare it to my favorite movies. So I like to listen to movies when I work. It calms this voice in my head. I don't really listen or pay attention to the movie, but it's like having music or having white noise in the background, right? And I do it with movies that I've seen, no joke, hundreds of times. Apollo 13, Miracle, Hunt for Red October, Endgame, because I can just play them and let them go. And I find a movie that I like, and this happened with Endgame, and I turn it on, and it's a little bit more distracting because I don't know it all. I don't know the lines and etc. So initially, it takes me longer to get through it, just like it will here. But it doesn't take that long for you to get familiar with it. And once you do, you'll see how much more powerful it is. And I'd also encourage you to look at extended events, not just as quote unquote the replacement for trace, but a whole new way of troubleshooting production, performance, digging into internals, right? If you use the histogram target, which we didn't talk about today, and as you can probably guess at this point, I was probably only supposed to talk for an hour, and I've way gone over that because I could talk about extended events for hours.
You can keep going. You're fine.
If people leave, it's okay. I'm not offended. But the histogram target only lets you bucket or group on one field. That's kind of a bummer, but you can capture the raw data and then group on more than one. And there are folks who loved to capture perfmon along with profiler and then view both of those together in the profiler UI. You can't do that with extended events. And it's interesting because when that was mentioned to the developers of extended events, they were like, oh, we didn't know you could do that. There is a user voice item out there requesting that to be added. I'm not sure of the status of that. And distributed replay. Depending on what version you're running, you still have to use trace, even though extended events is supported. But they've made changes so that it should now support extended events file. And distributed replay is evolving into DEA, which is Database Experimentation Assistant, which is a way to replay your workload. Very useful, not just on-prem, but in Azure if you're looking to migrate and you want to understand if the tier that you've picked can support your workload. So DEA has a bit of a ways to go, I think. Mindy Kurtnett has done a very good presentation on it if you're interested in that. So the things that I love, I can create so many sessions and they're available to everybody who has access to extended events and start and stop them as needed, right? They persist through restarts. Probably my number one thing. When I look at creating a session and I'm looking at the events, I have the ability to search. Track causality, I didn't even show you. Again, hang on, because I want to show you. Let me look at my event file, view target data. I'll open this up. And did I capture it? No, of course not. That would be too easy. Let me see if I've got another one out here that has it. That's not it. I didn't. It would be down here. I'm sorry that I didn't capture that, but the track causality is another option that I absolutely love. Writing to multiple targets. Even if I'm writing to a buffer target, I like to write out to the event file just so I can look at the data later. And I can look at the data in the UI. I don't have to use XQuery because I don't love XQuery and I don't want to bother Jonathan that much with it. And I frankly, I don't really want to learn it right now, I will admit. But some of you out there who have that mind and who love that type of thing, like run with yourself and create some fantastic scripts for parsing that information. But if you don't want to, you can do a ton in the data in the UI, or you can always push that data to a table and then work with it there. You're used to that probably. So when you're done with today, and when you go back to your desk, or if you're there and you're done with this and you need to do something related to tracing in SQL Server, like when you want to go open tracer profiler, just take 15 minutes and try what you want in extended events. Or take John's scripts right now, convert all your favorite templates over to extended event sessions, and then use your 15 minutes. I hopefully have a lot of resources for you here, and feel free again to send me an email if you've got a question. Just mention that you were at this user group so I have some frame of reference. And if you're still struggling, then I have a blog post, like why do you avoid that? And I wrote that blog post because product support and some folks at Microsoft, I'm like, listen, I'm trying to promote this, but sometimes even in Microsoft, I feel like you're not using it. And they're saying, well, we're trying to understand the pain points of customers. So that's why I have this blog post out there to help provide that information. So again, we talked about how we transition from what we do with Profiler over to extended events and some things to watch out for. We have 3 courses total out on Pluralsight. John and I both have kind of an introduction to extended events because we approach it differently. And if my approach doesn't work for you, his might, so check out his class. And he has an advanced class on extended events that goes even further. I wrote a few articles in a SQL Server Central Stairway. Jonathan's got tons of blog posts. I have a few as well. And then there's everything that's out on Microsoft. There were some utilities that were created if you were using older versions of SSMS, but these are really irrelevant at this point. Hopefully most of you are running the latest and greatest management studio. So that is everything I've got. Let me see, there's another question from Daniel. I hear the plan guides are harder to use in extended events than in profile. What's your thought? In terms of a plan guide, like I've always used the T-SQL to create a plan guide. And I'll be frank in that I don't love plan guides because I don't find them intuitive at all. So Daniel, I'd be interested in understanding a little bit better, like how they would be used through Profiler, what you're doing there, because most of the time I've seen them created through T-SQL, so maybe I'm missing something. But again, with 2016 and Query Store, we now have plan forcing, which is a whole another thing I can talk for hours about. But if you have questions that didn't get answered today, feel free to shoot me an email. And otherwise, again, thank you guys for making time and letting me go on here for a good hour and a half. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Erin. Thank you very much for coming in. I know that there's a few things on that I definitely learned. I'm a huge enjoyer of extended events. I might have sessions on that as well. So it's near and dear to my heart, getting everybody to try to use it. So
You can do it.
Absolutely, Team XE here.
Yep. There's a hashtag, right? It's a hashtag of Team XE.
Yep. All right. Well, again, thank you very much, Erin. And I'm guessing you'll probably at least get a few emails from some people. So be ready for those.
Awesome. Appreciate it. And again, email Paul.